The Minnesota Timberwolves are the surprise story of the NBA this season, a team that we had some expectations for, but certainly didn't think would be a contender. And as of right now, they're one of the best teams in the Western Conference and a legitimate contender to win the NBA title. And the reason all of this is so surprising is that Minnesota made their big move. They made the move that they thought was going to turn them into the team that they are now, but they did that 2 years ago. And then last year, they were a 42-win team. And at no point did they really look like a contender, and the team that they tried to build just never came together. Now, in fairness to that team last year, Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, those guys really didn't play together a ton. Cat missed a ton of time with injuries, and there were good pieces on the roster, but it was just a very up and down season. And this version of the team that we are seeing this year, this was the reason that they made the Gobert trade. I was critical of the trade at the time. I still think there are things you can kind of poke holes in, but you cannot argue with the results of this season and the vision they had for the team coming true this year. That vision begins in the front court with the combination of Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. The franchise believed in the idea of Cat as a complementary big alongside Gobert, a role that he played at times in college in his one season at Kentucky, where as a prospect, he was seen as kind of like a do-everything big, a guy that could do a lot of stuff for you, could shoot, could create a little bit in the post, could defend pretty well. And at the NBA level, he became this big-time scorer and the shooter, but he still has that skill set, and they believed in his ability to play alongside Rudy Gobert in the front court and to kind of zag a little bit. Everybody was going smaller. Everybody was going towards these really skilled perimeter players, and Minnesota decided that a bigger front court was a big advantage for them. And then, of course, Rudy Gobert, the guy that they brought in as the combo there in the front court with Cat, and building a great defense around Gobert was always part of the plan, and that's come to fruition this season. Gobert, since he became the guy that he has now been, he basically is a top 10, a top 12 defense in and of himself. Whenever he is out there, they're a great defensive team, no matter what team that he's on, and that was something that Minnesota was counting on. But the thing that really changed everything for Minnesota this year and last year is that Anthony Edwards has taken a jump and a leap towards being, a top 10 player across the entire NBA. And as interesting as this team now is, as cool as it is to see kind of the results of the Rudy Gobert trade turn around this season compared to last year, and as well, I would argue, as those two guys actually have fit in the front court together, none of it matters. They're not nearly as competitive if Anthony Edwards doesn't make the leap that he has. He's an incredible individual scorer. He's getting much better as a passer and as a facilitator. And the defensive stuff, all these numbers, all these metrics that point to Minnesota as not only the best defense in the league this year, but a historically good defense over the past 10 seasons when you compare this year to other teams. A lot of that stuff, yes, you have to go with the size that they have and Rudy Gobert in the front court, but Anthony Edwards guards really well as well. And having someone that has that kind of a two-way impact is incredibly important for a team that sees themselves as title contenders at the moment. And again, the interesting part of this is that it did come as a surprise. Coming into the season, I have a video going back to the beginning of the year saying, I think that Minnesota could actually be a really good team, just depending on how the front court stuff works out. And we saw how well they played in the postseason once they got everybody healthy, despite not winning a playoff series. And I kind of had expectations for them, but I didn't expect them to actually immediately and fully establish themselves as one of the best teams in the conference. And if you had to ask me right now if Minnesota is a contender to make the finals and win the title, I think they absolutely are. I still have concerns about them as a team, but it's crazy how much things have turned around. And in terms of the Gobert trade itself, one of the criticisms that I had of the deal was not only the value and the compensation that Minnesota was sending back, but also this idea that Gobert was starting to slip a little bit as he got older. He's still a very good, very impactful defensive player, but some of the advanced numbers, some of the eye test stuff had really started to fall off. That has turned around this year. Rudy Gobert has been awesome once again, and again, the fit alongside Karl-Anthony Towns in the front court has worked even better than I ever thought that it would. And as we go now into the postseason, it's a really interesting team to keep an eye on as well, because in theory, they're kind of matchup dependent, right? Like, it depends on who they match up against in the postseason, but also some of the best teams in the conference, like the Nuggets, they play really well against those teams. And so Minnesota is absolutely going to be a scary postseason team. Having said all those things, I have two big concerns with Minnesota. First and foremost, Karl-Anthony Towns in the postseason in big games makes me nervous. We have too many examples in the past of this guy making strange decisions, getting into foul trouble, getting in his own head, and just having really poor postseason performances. And I'm just a little bit nervous about that. For a team that I'm talking about as a team that could possibly make the finals, for one of their better guys to be someone that I don't fully trust in the postseason, that's a concern for me, 100%. And Karl-Anthony Towns is extremely talented, and the rest of the roster is very good, but it is a concern. The other part of this as well is that they are very reliant on those three guys, Ant, Cat, and Gobert, and staggering those big minutes in the front court. They're very reliant on those three players. McDaniels has been fine, but not as good offensively this year as I would have hoped. And then the rest of the roster is solid. It's fine. I really like Naz Reid off the bench, but in terms of like their core group of guys, they're incredibly heavily reliant on Rudy Gobert, who's had issues in the postseason in the past, and Karl-Anthony Towns, who's had issues in the postseason in the past, and Anthony Edwards, who is an extremely young player. And so when you look at some of these teams that we're going to be looking at trying to push for the title this year, amongst those teams, Minnesota has the least amount of kind of not even like postseason experience, but like big game experience, things you can point to and say, I'm really confident in this group of guys that they can get it done. But on paper right now, just based off the regular season numbers and the metrics, there's no reason to believe that Minnesota can't make a push for the title this season. And that is an incredible turnaround from a deal that I honestly thought was a complete disaster for them at the time that they made it. I didn't understand the fit of Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert in the front court. I didn't understand the value they were trading away in exchange for Gobert. And I didn't understand that if Gobert was actually going to be as valuable for them as they believed that it would be. But absolutely 100% I was wrong. And this version of the team is the vision they had for the team when they made the Gobert trade. And it's really, really cool when you see that kind of stuff turn around and get figured out after what was just like a worst case scenario season for them last year. And my other favorite thing too about Minnesota is they just play different. Like a lot of times when you're watching games on a night-to-night basis in the NBA, a lot of teams look the same. There's a lot of ball screen stuff, and then they kick it out and they shoot threes, they drive to the rim. Minnesota is just a little bit different. They do attack sometimes in post-ups with Karl-Anthony Towns. They have these two bigs that sometimes it gets a little clunky in the front court, but a lot of times their size just completely overwhelms teams as well. And they just have this really interesting play style that isn't necessarily as aesthetically pleasing as like, you know, some of the Nuggets games or something, but they're just a little bit different. And I hope that them being different is a positive for them in the postseason. And I hope that they figure out a way to make a run, because I want this team to continue in this version of itself. If they have a poor postseason performance, if they lose in the first round for whatever reason, I could see a scenario in which they break this down and they trade Gobert and they try and get some stuff. There's constantly Karl-Anthony Towns possible trade rumors. There's constantly connections of him to like the Knicks or the Nets and all these different things. Now, obviously, any postseason performance doesn't necessarily guarantee that anything is going to change in Minnesota, but it's clear that this is Anthony Edwards' team moving forward. And if there need to be changes within the roster to build a contending team around him as he ideally ascends into one of the best players in the league over the next couple of seasons, then those are changes that Minnesota is probably going to be willing to make. And I'm getting ahead of myself thinking about their postseason performance, thinking about possible changes to the roster. Really, this video should be about being excited about a team that has figured it out. A lot of times when you make a move that doesn't look good initially, or after the first year or two, it doesn't look good, we never really fully give it a chance to get figured out and to fully acclimate to a new situation. And I'm glad that Minnesota is able to figure it out this year, because one, it creates an even more interesting Western Conference picture. They're a team that matches up particularly well with some of the better teams in the conference, but also I don't really want disaster scenarios. I don't want a team to give up a ton of stuff for Rudy Gobert and then him be terrible. This kind of scenario was always more fun, and it's really, really been a nice story this season. I hope this group sticks together. I really appreciate kind of the difference that this group brings to the table. I really appreciate Karl-Anthony Towns' willingness to become a complementary piece alongside of Anthony Edwards, and I cannot wait to see what Minnesota looks like in the postseason this year.